The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian. This is our first new show of the new year, and if you're going to be pedantic about it, it's also our first show of the new decade. I know, some of you thought the pandemic 20s actually began last year in the year 2020. Pandemic 20s doesn't sound quite like so much fun as the Roaring 20s. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in again for more chronicles of weird tales in weird times. And for our first story this week, we start with another calendrical debate. When is Twelfth Night? The supposed last night of the Christmas season, after which you have to take down all your Christmas decorations. Some people reckon Christmas Eve is the first night of Christmas, so the 5th of January is Twelfth Night. Others reckon the first night is Christmas Day night, so the 12th night is on the 6th of January. And yet others argue that Christmas Day may be the starting point, but they believe that the eve of the 12th night, so that's the 5th, is actually 12th night, rather than 12th night day. Yes, I know, very confusing. And then there's the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January, when the three wise men or three kings turn up with their gifts. And indeed, in parts of Europe, Three Kings' Day is when you actually hand over your Christmas presents. And let's not forget Old Christmas Day, still celebrated in areas where the Russian Orthodox Church predominates, which is also on the 6th of January. It's a hangover from that old Julian, New Gregorian calendar change back in the 18th century. However, I've been delving through the reference books and I think I've found the perfect solution. We revert to the pattern of our ancestors, at least up to until Victorian times, when the last day of Christmas is Candlemas Day on the 2nd of February. And that is when you have to stop celebrating Christmas and take down your decorations. I know some of you are thinking, well, we'll be lucky to get through the turkey we've bought by 2nd of February. And to be fair, 2nd of February, your Christmas tree, if you've got a real one, is probably going to be looking pretty sickly by then anyway. So, here's what the 17th century English poet Robert Herrick, he was a cavalier during the English Civil War and didn't do too well because he was on the losing side, but still found time to write some poetry. Here's what he had to say about a Candlemas. End now the white loaf and the pie. Let all sports with Christmas die. He also wrote, down with the rosemary and so, down with the bays and mistletoe, down with the holly, ivy all, wherewithal ye dressed the Christmas hall. And he also wrote, kindle the Christmas brand, and then till sunset let it burn. When quenched, then lay it up again till Christmas next return. Part must be kept wherewith to tend the Christmas log next year. And where 'tis safely kept, the fiend can do no mischief there. Doesn't quite rhyme, does it? Now, I say, he was writing in the middle of a civil war, so he probably was distracted. And it's probably fair to say that Robert Herrick had a bit of a thing about Candlemas, as he wrote a good 3 or 4 poems about it. However, his verses do touch upon a couple of interesting pieces of Christmas folklore. The first is that it is very bad luck to leave up any decorations after Candlemas. In fact, he warns that your home will be overrun with goblins if you forget to remove even one branch of holly. And the second piece of folklore, his verse about the Christmas brand, as in lump of wood burning. It's the old idea of the Yule Log you've been burning since December. And yes, we are talking about a time of huge open fireplaces when you'd bring in half a tree trunk to burn throughout the winter. The idea is you keep one piece of the log somewhere safe in your home for the rest of the year, which will bring you good luck, and then you use it, this bit of old wood, as kindling for next year's Yule log the following December. Yeah? Given central heating has replaced open fires in most homes, I suppose what you could do today is make a symbolic Yule log out of a piece of timber, dressed with candles and holly as a table decoration. And then you cut off a small sliver of this wood and keep it until next December and use it to light candles for next year's Yule log. Right, anyway, to sum up, forget about whether Twelfth Night is on the 5th or 6th. Let's agree it's on Candlemas Day on the 2nd of February. Right. Also, keeping back bits of holly or mistletoe after Candlemas is bad, but keeping back a bit of the Yule log till the following Christmas is good. I hope you're following that. And that's it, the party over. Well, no, because the 2nd of February you can still celebrate Candlemas, or you can celebrate St. Bridget, St. Bridie's Day, which is the same day, or you can celebrate the pagan Wiccan festival of Imbolc, spelled Imbolc just to be confusing, all of which are opportunities for having a bonfire, having a few drinks and eating cake. Cake. And now here's Janie making a welcome return to the show with some folklore and countryside traditions about birds and eggs and things.
Yes, hello. And it's nice to be back.
It's nice to have you back.
Oh, thank you. I thought perhaps I'd been let go.
No, not at all.
Well, I have been very busy, but that's another story. But
Exactly.
yes, that's very nice to delve into the world of the weird and arcane and frankly quite mad. Yeah. Back into the mad world. Anyway, the first little item is about birds, which I do have a bit of penchant for, as you know.
Yes, indeedy.
Slightly nerdy. But I didn't realise that there's so many... Well, obviously, we all know some of the common descriptive terms for a group of animals, particularly birds, such as a murder of crows. I mean, we've all heard of that parliament of owls. Skein of geese, which we just accept, don't we? What is a skein? Who knows? It was also a gaggle of geese. Well, I suppose that's a bit more obvious, isn't it?
Yes, because of the noise they make.
Make that noise. But there are many, many, many others, even weirder, which I won't go through all of them because we'd be here all night. But basically, it seems that it was about the Middle Ages in the UK. Hunting became incredibly popular, and as obviously upper classes, etc. And new terms had to be thought of to describe these collection of animals.
Right.
And it just took off. They went mad about the next century, naming everything, sometimes twice. And but going back to a murder of crows, of course, there could be reasons for that because they might, as being scavengers, carrion, they might have been near battlefields, gallows.
They were always associated with battlefields.
Yeah. Plus, obviously, they would take lambs, which wouldn't have gone down that well. So yes, they got that name maybe from that. But as I say, there's just here are just a few of the others. I like the one called A Dropping of Pigeons. Yeah, well, what can you say?
Which is appropriate if you've ever stood on a London Underground station.
Yes, don't. They're always so unsavoury, aren't they, in London, but elsewhere, big cities in the rest of the world. But London pigeons are just grim. Anyway, a knot of toads, a knot, but as in Knot. A building of rooks. Don't question why. Yes. I do not know. Okay. A muster of storks. Yeah, I suppose, they muster together. I don't know. What else? A peep of chickens.
A peep?
A peep. Really?
Right.
It's true. A plump of wildfowl. A wisp of snipe. A wake of vultures. This is all true. An unkindness of ravens. I have
heard of that one.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
I heard of that one banded around. You know,
It's been used by, I think, a couple of crime writers as book titles. Some of those phrases come in.
This could kind of, you can imagine, a tidings of magpies. Well, they have the little rhymes, don't they?
Yes, they do.
You know? What else we got? A rafter of turkeys. A rafter, as in you might find in a roof.
Yes.
No idea why. Yeah. A parliament of rooks, as well as a parliament of owls. They liked that one. They used it twice.
Yes.
A quarrel of sparrows. I thought that was quite obvious, really. If you hear them, I mean, they're tweeting. They don't sound like they're quarrelling. But they're very vocal, aren't they?
They are.
We have little flocks of them around here. And a siege of cranes. Don't know. Yeah. A team of ducks on the wing. A spring of teal. A train of jackdaws. You're going to have to turn me off as I just go on and on. Please do. I don't mind.
What's the most bonkers one you can find there?
Oh, dear me. A piteousness of doves. And
Well, they do make a bit of a sad cooing
I suppose they do,
noise.
don't they? Yeah. And not to be confused with a pitying of turtle doves. So we had the piteousness of doves and a pitying of turtle doves.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, now you say that, budding writers, there's some good titles in there, isn't there? Because they're kind of nonsense, so you could make them be about anything. Yeah. A kettle of hawks.
Yeah.
A nigh, N-Y-E, of pheasants while on the ground.
Right.
And then I think they have some other one where they're flying away and they're called something else. Where they've just a bouquet. This is possibly the most balmy. A bouquet of pheasants when they're flushed up. Yeah.
Yeah.
A confusion of guinea fowl. A clutter of starlings. A chattering of chuffs. You know, chuffs. Those
Yes.
black ones. Black.
Yeah.
I'll describe a chuff for you if you like.
Okay.
Slightly, it's about the size of a crow with a red beak.
All right.
Found mainly in Scotland, I believe.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so that's really all I can say. But they it's fascinating. Real. Oh, there's a drove of donkeys as well. So it's not entirely, as we know, just birds.
Yes.
They branched out into the equine field as well.
Well, you have it with fish and mammals, don't you? Because you have a pod of whales, it is, or something like that.
Yeah. I think there was something in my head about fish. It's not a shoal of fish, but it's something like that.
There's a school of fish.
Shoal. Anyway, yes.
Anyway, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. There we are.
Right. Thank you very much. And you've also got something about eggs from said birdies.
Yes, it kind of goes with the birdies, doesn't it? Yes, so it might be one of those things, not a lot of people know this type of thing, but then that means some do. So if you do, bear with me, yeah. Keeping chickens. And obviously, one of the reasons for that is to collect their eggs.
And of course, with lockdown here in the UK, a lot of people are now setting up home gardens and keeping chickens and doing things of that nature.
That's right. This is a COVID information commercial. If you have taken on some chickens and they're having a nice time, dropping their eggs everywhere and you don't know where to find them, and so therefore you don't know which ones are fresh, there is a way that's infallible, apparently. And it's built on science, so as you could imagine, fresh eggs, they don't, well, you wouldn't imagine, they contain very little air. But when they get older, the bigger the air cell becomes inside them, which kind of makes sense to me somehow. I don't know, they might just shrivel up a bit and then anyway, they have more air in them when they're older. So if you fill a bowl or a saucepan with cold water and then carefully put the egg into the water and carefully observe what happens next, this will tell you all you need to know. Because if the egg lies on its side at the bottom of the bowl, it's completely fresh, because obviously it hasn't got much air in it.
Yes.
If it stands up and moves around a little, that's the egg, of course, it's not fresh, as it could be.
Yes.
But it's still edible.
Yes.
Which we might need to have, what with breakfast and food. We might always just be eating eggs and nettles. Anyway, if the egg floats on the surface of the water, it's very stale, and do not eat it.
Right.
And then finally, if the egg actually cracks underwater and a small chick comes out, it's what it is. It's a middle-class chicken having a pool birth. I did make that bit up, to be fair.
Thank you, Janie.
You're welcome.
We're going through a particularly cold spell in the UK at the moment. People are talking about the beast from the east. Lots of snow and cold wind blowing off Siberia and travelling over to the east of England, which is where we're based. So here's a remedy for a magical hot toddy. Yes, magic. Though it does appear to be mainly the magic of alcohol. Okay, here's the recipe. Warm a mug, so it's not stone cold to start with. Squeeze the juice of 1/2 lemon into it. Add a tablespoon of honey and 1/2 teaspoon of grated raw ginger. Then add a jigger, a shot or 2 shots of whiskey or brandy or rum. Then fill the mug with near boiling water and stir well, but here's where the magic comes in. You stir it in a sunwise or deersill direction, and as you stir it, you say the following words: lemons full of vitamin C, heat of ginger, honey, bees, whiskey soulful, rich and warm, keep my body safe from harm. And then you drink it. To complete the magical process, you should envision its healing qualities, imbuing your body with protective vigour. Or just take it as a rather nice alcoholic drink on a cold winter's night. Time for this week's interview. In the hot seat is Melissa Edmundson, the editor and curator of Woman's Weird 2, a new book from Handheld Press, which looks at and contains stories by some of the forgotten women of weird fiction. You know, everyone still talks about and reads H.P. Lovecraft, Algernon Blackwood and William Hope Hodgson. But what about the women who also wrote some of the scariest, unsettling fiction of that era? Melissa Edmundson is a lecturer in English literature at Clemson University in South Carolina and works on 19th and early 20th century British women writers with a particular interest in women's supernatural fiction. She is the author of women's ghost literature in 19th century Britain and of women's colonial Gothic writing, 1850 to 1930, subtitle The Haunted Empire. She edited Avenging Angels, ghost stories by Victorian women writers, and also Women's Weird, Strange Stories by Women, 1890 to 1940, which came out in 2019. And we're talking about the sequel to Women's Weird 2. Right, and it's my pleasure to be talking to Melissa Edmundson, the author of Women's Weird 2, and we're going to be talking about the book and weird fiction. Hello, Melissa.
Hello, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Right, I suppose the starting point is, where does weird fiction begin and how does it overlap with ghost stories, supernatural horror, gothic fiction, other forms of speculative fiction?
Right. That was something that I really tried to kind of tackle, that definition, or maybe a lack of definition of what weird literature actually is, in the first volume of Women's Weird. And I think it is interesting because, a lot like all these sort of terms like the gothic, the weird, they always seem to elude definition. That it's really hard to, once we think we have them pinned down, that there's something that, surprises us or maybe proves an exception to some sort of rule. So I really did try to, again, in that first volume, look at definitions. And I think the main thing I came up with is the consensus is there is no real, good definition of the weird. But I think that's a good thing, actually, that, it's always keeping us on our toes.
Yeah.
But I think one of the best definitions I found was actually in Anne and Jeff Vandermeer's book, The Weird, that they did a few years ago, the collection that they edited. And they said it's more of a sensation that you know it when you feel it or when you read it. And I like that idea of there's just something off in the weird. And I think that it does differ from something maybe like a ghost story. And again, not all ghost stories, but for the weird, there's never really a sort of a good conclusion. That there's always that sense of unease or mystery that's at the end of a story that's considered weird. But yeah, I mean, horror writing, again, I think that has, different parameters. And when I was trying to, pick the stories for the 2 volumes of Women's Weird, there were stories that I didn't include because, I said to myself and Kate, the director of Handheld Press, we go back and forth when we're deciding on the stories. And there were just a few that I said, okay, I'm not going to include because they do venture too far into horror.
Yeah.
But with the ghost story too, I think, that's interesting. I've talked with other people and they say it's all weird, whether it's ghost stories or horror, supernatural, gothic. But I think there are some nice connections. I think it's important to try to define these modes as best we can, but I think it's sort of nice to look at the connections between them as well.
Yes, because I mean, one of the writers who's frequently cited and very influential is M.R. James. And his books aren't really ghost stories. They definitely fall into the realm of supernatural horror, but without going into visceral slasher horror, if you like.
Right. But people always talk about that's so true. And people always talk about the ghost stories of M.R. James. But like you said, if you really start to think about it, how many of them actually are ghost stories?
Yeah, exactly. Most of them involve unpleasant demons.
I know. It's interesting. I think that brings up a really interesting point because I think sometimes ghost stories are used as sort of a catch-all term. And, not all stories are ghost stories. There are several that I included in Women's Weird. And when I did include ghost stories, I tried to do something a little bit different than what would be maybe a traditional ghost story. And some people who have read and commented on the story said, whatever was a ghost story. And I was thinking, I didn't really think it was a ghost story.
Yeah. It's as you say, though, it's one of those things with definition. You can just go round and round in circles. It's like in science fiction where I had for a period, there was a vogue for slipstream, which basically meant a bit of everything. Yeah. Now, looking at the stories in Women's Weird 2, and I'm afraid I haven't read Women's Weird 1, but in terms of the times your authors were writing, it overlaps with that era of M.R. James, who we've just mentioned, H.P. Lovecraft, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, and William Hope Hodgson, all of whom are still in print today and still read today. Why is it, do you think, that women haven't quite fared so well as that? Edith Nesbit's Man Size in Marble still crops up in anthologies, but a lot of the other women writers seem to have been sort of doomed to obscurity. Is it they didn't get the profile when they were actively writing, or is it, the phrase, isn't it, for women writers, the creatives, the pram in the hallway. Their domestic life meant they couldn't devote as much time to it, or is it just plain sexism?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that it's really a combination of reasons. So, to think about, some of those, partly I think it is sort of what I call tunnel vision when it comes to editing some of these anthologies. And, by no means do I mean all anthologies, but there are a great number that tend to, starting maybe mid-20th century, into the later part of the century, they tended to, as you say, the male authors that you listed, they tended to reprint the same stories sort of over and over again. And, so we had that sort of core group that, again, was getting republished and republished. And I mean, every time they get republished, I guess they build that bigger audience. So people knew a lot about them. And I think that, maybe we got too worked up, focused on that one group of men who were writing. And we need to kind of do and that's what I'm trying to do. And I know several other people now are doing that as well, which is great. But, going back to contemporary sources, looking at periodicals and magazines, looking at collections. Some of them are, quite hard to find at times, but, just tracking down these authors. And when you do that, you really find that these women were writing, a lot of these stories. And I guess you can say in some ways it was, there was a bit of sexism, as you mentioned, mainly because I think women's stories were frequently labeled, domestic. They were too domestic. They were too centered on the home. And I think a lot of that maybe comes out of the Victorian period where you had, women and men, writing sensation fiction and romances and things like that. And even today, romance sort of has a kind of a stigma attached to it. Yeah. But, what some of my work has been doing, in these last, decade or so that I've been working on this, looking at how these domestic stories actually are quite subversive. And that holds up with the supernatural weird fiction written by women as well. And I always find it interesting that women say, or that, people say, oh, women wrote domestic, it's too maybe boring even. But, the domestic to me, when you put that into a supernatural or weird story, it heightens, I think, the fear, because the domestic is supposed to be the safe place, right? The place where we go to be safe, to be sort of away from the world, that's the place that we can supposedly control, the best if we can't control anything else. And when we have a horror or a supernatural or weird story happening in the domestic space, that just, to me, heightens the fear, because that's supposed to be the safest space. And in these stories, frequently it is not. So, I think that, again, it goes back to, I think it's just several reasons going into that. But even, I mentioned the male authors, but you mentioned Edith Nesbit, Man Size in Marble. And I think you're right, to say that she's probably one of the, the women authors who have been anthologized, more so than others. But, you tend to see, and Man Size in Marble is excellent. It's a wonderful story. I think it's, one of the best weird stories out there. But just with that story, you see that anthologized sort of again and again. Yeah. And, Nesbit wrote, at least 2 collections where it was mainly, weird stories. And then she, wrote in magazines and periodicals as well. And people are working on rediscovering those. So, she wrote so much. So maybe we should move away from Man Size in Marble and look at, some of her other work.
Yeah. I mean, noticeably, she does often crop up as E. Nesbit. And is that her dropping the female part so that her stories might be more acceptable to a male audience? You think?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that brings up a whole other point too, where I was thinking too in volume 1, we had trying to think, Frances Stevens, who again was a woman writer, writing under a male name. So you frequently had, one of the reasons too, it goes back to, your original question about why these women weren't anthologized, is as often a lot of them did write under, male pseudonyms, initials. They're, so anonymous even. So sometimes it's hard to, you have to really do the work to go back and find and say, oh, wait a minute, this wasn't actually a man writing, this was a woman.
Yeah, yeah. Do the women writers you featured, are their subject matters similar or significantly different to the work of male writers? Obviously, one factor is that from the stories I've read, the women do tend to involve the whole family, or at least their partner or somebody else, whereas a lot of the male writers are very much Edwardian club. It's all men, and women, if they're featured at all, crop up in a very minor role as servants or something, coming in making the tea. But, they're not an integral part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there are sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle differences, between stories authored by men versus women. I think one of the things that I keep going back to with women's stories, and this is true, I think for the, again, weird ghost stories, supernatural, that you always seem to have that, I guess it's like a human element in women's stories that I think sometimes is lacking in male author stories, that we have this, ability to draw a character. I think sometimes, and again, there's always exceptions to the rule, so I don't want to generalize too much, but with a lot of male authored stories, I have a feeling when I'm reading them that it's really about that weird, right? That weird element, that supernatural element.
Yeah.
And the story is really built around that. And there's some great, effective stories written that way. But I think with women, they're very careful to draw out a character, and they make you sort of care about that character. Some of these stories take a while to sort of build up to the supernatural weird element. But in doing that, they give us, I think, more of a backstory for a lot of these characters. So we care about the character in those opening pages. And I think in a way that sort of heightens the weird element coming in, because we're kind of right there with that character. We want them to, sort of overcome whatever they're struggling against, this, weird thing that's happening to them. So I think I think that's one of the major differences that really stands out to me, is that, their ability to sort of, and maybe it goes back again to, their, dealing with the domestic, that's something that they're able to do, kind of transfer that domestic emphasis onto the weird story.
Yeah. I mean, picking up on that point, and you make it in the introduction to Weird Women too, it's the number of times the title of the story includes something like room or house in the title. Again, bringing it onto the domestic side of things, doesn't it?
It does, and that was something that I have to admit surprised me when I was working on the collection. And like I said, Kate and I sort of go back and forth and consider. I give her a list of stories, and we discuss them and disagree, and have fun talking about them. And it was actually after we had finalized the contents list, and I looked at them. And I said, exactly what you're saying. Oh my, there's so many, stories here that have room or, house in the title. And, I think, yeah, you're right. That does go back to that emphasis on the domestic and sort of that intimate space that we get in a lot of these stories. And again, I think it connects to that emphasis on, the people that inhabit those spaces. So that I think it's a nice balance for me, between that intimate space, what's happening with that individual, and then you have that sort of juxtaposed with the otherworldly, right, unexplainable, weird element that sort of surrounds the person. So I think these stories, I think, have that nice mix of personal, intimate, and then the otherworldly, unexplainable element.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And talking of the stories, the other thing that seems notable about weird fiction and all the various subgenres surrounding it is the short story format seems to suit it better. I suppose the slow build-up and then the climax when the ghost horror or whatever is revealed, whereas it seems a lot harder trick for anybody to sustain that with a full-length book. I mean, in recent times, the only ghost full-length book would probably be, I don't know, Susan Hill's Woman in Black, something like that.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's interesting that, we don't have, and it is true, it seems like the horror novel or the supernatural novel is almost more of a modern thing, late 20th, 21st century, thing now. But yeah, I mean, and I feel like we've sort of lost the art of the short story a lot of times. So I'm glad to see, recently it seems like more collections of short stories, supernatural are coming out now. But yeah, at the time, and I think it goes back to, I believe, I'm not completely sure, but I think it was Edgar Allan Poe who wrote about how the short story, this type of horror story, supernatural, it's meant to be in a short story because, like you said, you can sustain that suspense over, a shorter period of time and have more effect, on the reader. And I think, pacing is so important in these stories that,
yes.
and it's interesting too. Again, it's sort of just happened that way. But in both volumes, there are some very short stories, and there's some longer stories as well. There's a few I'm thinking that maybe even verge on novella length. Mm-hmm. But in both those lengths, I really think that the pacing is quite good, and that's something that Kate and I we did talk quite a bit about that was important. To have that pace, and not right, like you said, in that short story, you have you don't have that maybe that issue of losing the reader's interest, but you also have a shorter space, so you have to make that count, in that word. And a lot of times we had these stories being published in magazines as well,
exactly.
So that might have something to do, with it. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I mean you were saying just now how it seems that it's only relatively recently that the novel has come back. But I suppose one of the reasons is, there's I suppose two reasons. One, the magazines, the number of them carrying short stories has hugely declined in recent years.
It has.
And it's always one of the things you hear from publishers and agents, that it's impossible to sell short story collections. People like a novel. So they're turning them down just as a matter of, rule of thumb. Short story collections don't sell, don't bother sending them in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's actually something, when you mention that, when I have looked at authors' letters and things like that, that's something that it seems to have always been an issue, because I've had a couple of, when I was looking at some publishers' archives and things like that, I've had publishers writing to certain authors, trying to get them to write a novel instead of a short story. And they were saying exactly, it's funny, they're saying exactly what you just said, that, the short story collections are not going to sell. You need to, do something else. So maybe times haven't changed all that much when it comes to short stories.
Yes, it's obviously one of those things that publishers and agents haven't changed their excuses over the decades.
Exactly.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing because, again, in your introduction, you talk about the Weird Tales magazine and the fact that for a long time it had a female editor, Dorothy McElwraith, is it? And
right.
a female artist, Margaret Brundage, who I see, was called the First Lady of Pulp magazine illustration. So, it's not as if women weren't there. They were there at the highest places.
Right, and C.L. Moore is another, frequent contributor. So they were there. They really were there. A lot of their authors were women. So that was one of the things that I wanted to try to do with doing a second volume of Women's Weird, is to what can we do in the second volume to sort of make it different, make it complementary to the first, without rehashing things. And one of them was a more geographical scope. And I also wanted to bring in a couple of writers, and I talk about weird tales, as you mentioned in the introduction, a little bit. So I have we have Lucy Maud Montgomery, and again, maybe a little bit of a surprise, and then we have Mary Elizabeth Councilman, her story.
Yeah.
It was great to include some of those authors as well.
Yes, I mean, picking up on the Lucy Maud Montgomery and also Edith Nesbit, it's the fact that they wrote in such a broad range of genres, because, say, Montgomery is the woman behind Anne of Green Gables, and Edith Nesbit, among other things, wrote The Railway Children, and that puts them in an entirely different category. You didn't get H.P. Lovecraft writing children's adventure stories.
That could be interesting.
Yeah. Well, not normal children and not normal adventures.
Yeah, I think that it is something that it's interesting to think about, that these women, like you said, they did frequently write children's literature. I'm thinking a person I haven't included, Mary Louisa Molesworth, did the same thing, where she was known for children's literature, and she wrote, a couple collections of really, really good supernatural fiction. Edith Nesbit the same way. And this is something I've wanted to, for the past few years, look into this a little bit more, because I feel like right now I'm sort of, conjecturing. But I think maybe some of it had to do with, what we talked about right before, that, it was about money, to a certain extent, that, children's literature was selling very well. Writing novels and things. Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote a fair number of novels. I think some of that goes back to the fact that maybe, publishers were trying to steer them away from the short story. But maybe, again, it's something that I think that they wanted, they obviously wanted to write these stories, because they, Edith Nesbit published, like I said, at least 2 collections of supernatural fiction. And it was, maybe someplace they could stretch themselves, as writers. And I know that an author that I include in Volume 2, Mary Wilkins Freeman, this is more evidence that I have, that she actually wrote to a friend, a fellow writer, and she said, expressly said, that she wished she could write more supernatural weird fiction, but her publisher sort of steered her away from it. So I think that's really an interesting idea, that, they were able to, maybe, like I said, some of it maybe was money. But, I don't think all of it was. I think some of it was just they were trying to, do something different. Like I said, kind of stretch themselves as authors as well. And there are a lot of, like, I'm thinking of other people too, like D.K. Broster and Margaret Irwin. Some of the authors that I include, they're known as historical novelists, and maybe that goes back again to a nice connection to your previous, question about why these women weren't included. They were known for other things. Yeah. Nesbit was known as a children's author, so it tends to maybe cover a little bit more what she was doing in the the genre. Yeah. Yeah,
and again, it echoes when we're talking about publishers saying nobody wants short story collections. They do tend to like their authors to fit in a nice little niche, and once it's established, they don't really want them going out there and potentially confusing the audience, do they?
Exactly.
We don't want somebody buying Man Size in Marble thinking it's a sort of sequel to The Railway Children or something and giving their kids nightmares.
Right. I can see, publishers saying, this is our formula for success. Let's stick to it.
on a sort of technical issue, your cover photo for the Weird Women 2 is Virginia Aldoni, the Countess Castiglione, who was a notorious character in the late 19th century, mid-19th century, and the lover of several emperors and kings. What attracted you to using the picture? Obviously, the fact that it is a stunning picture.
It really is. Well, that goes back actually, looking at the two volumes together. On volume 1, I found an image of Dolores, and it's actually a woman, believe it or not. If you've seen the cover, it's a wedding dress. It was a wedding dress. She has sort of this Mercury headdress veil on, but that was a Vogue photo shoot in 1919, I want to say. And I wanted to choose that image because I wanted something where it was contemporary, and it was a woman looking at the reader, and then having a little bit of an element of mystery. So for volume 1, we have her holding the crystal ball, but she's not looking at the crystal ball, she's sort of gazing out at the reader. So looking at volume 2, I was like, okay, how can I continue? I want to continue that theme. And I was looking, and the Met Museum has a wonderful online collection, and a lot of it is public domain, which is great. And I was looking, and when I found that image, I said, this is it. And I have, she's sitting there, and it's a woman, looking out. You're looking at her, but she's also looking out at you, and you have that gaze.
Yeah.
So that's really what sort of sealed the deal for that particular. But yeah, I'm really happy, and I think Kate with Handheld has gotten a lot of compliments about her covers are really good.
Yeah. What is the enduring attraction of weird fiction to readers? Because on a first one level, you'd think, well, they're frequently scary, unsettling stories, but you can't help but, well, someone like me can't help but be fascinated by them. And, I've read weird fiction stories late at night that have given me nightmares, but doesn't stop me doing it again. What do you think the attraction is?
Well, I think, on one level, what you just said, it's fun and it's entertaining to be scared, but then also know that you're safe. You're in your bed reading at night, or in your comfy chair or wherever, and you're safe, but you're experiencing this fear, and this character who's in danger. So I think that there's one level, these stories will always be entertaining and fun. But I think another one maybe connects back to that sort of maybe subversive element. But I think it's the fact that although these stories are, about otherworldly, / supernatural creatures, that their stories on some level, I think, always tell us something about ourselves. So we have this common, fear or anxiety. And, these stories allow us to sort of, through the characters, maybe look and kind of confront what scares us. And I think that's really interesting that, different people have different reactions to these stories as well. Like, I've been talking with people about these collections, and, they say, oh, well, some really scared me, and others I found entertaining and not as scary. And I think that's interesting that it's so personal, that it varies from one person to another. Like, oh, I really found this scary, and someone else might say, no, it didn't really work for me. So I think, but those stories, I think that's sort of key, is these stories always tell us something about ourselves. It's like we're looking in a mirror, and something's, coming back at us and telling us something about ourselves.
I mean, it is a kind of human trait, the scary storytelling, particularly in the comfort of your own home, and gathered round the fire. The tradition of 60, 70 years ago of sort of pre-television era, if you like, of over Christmas time, gathering round the fire, telling ghost stories and things, but you're all safe and sound, and the wind and the snow's whistling outside, but you're all snug, and but there's that shiver of anticipation.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. It's about, coming to terms with what is outside, sort of, the unknown, like you said, but also maybe having the ability to appreciate the safety, and being able to gather and be protected, that kind of throws that into relief. Yeah.
What about you personally? What drew you to weird fiction?
Well, this was something that I said, that I have been working on now, going on, if I think about it, going on almost 20 years. But yeah, it was something that originally, when I was doing the work for my PhD, I was surprised that at that point, not that much had been written about women and the subversive qualities of their ghost stories and looking at social elements. So that's really where I got started. And then, I was lucky enough to, start doing these edited editions, which I really do enjoy. I think that it's really nice to be able to bring these writers back to a wider reading public. And the responses that we've gotten from both of these volumes has really been great. That, people are now, hopefully, they've told me, oh, I really enjoyed so-and-so's story. Now I'm going to go try to find more of her stories.
Yes.
And that's just wonderful to me that, these volumes, help people do that and discover authors.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, and just trying to maybe, I don't know, maybe the term rescue, some of these stories by women, again, what we talked about previously, from this label of, oh, it's too domestic, it's too, boring, and, saying, well, not always, that a lot of these stories can be, quite scary, or they can at least make you think about maybe an uncomfortable social or cultural element that they're bringing out, through maybe a little bit indirectly, but bringing out through, the ghost or the demon, or whatever's in the story. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about when you were a kid? Did you go in for scary stories or scary movies, or?
It's strange. I don't think that I did too much. I mean, I was, a child of the late 70s and 80s, so of course I watched Scooby-Doo and things like that. So maybe that had something to do with it. And I had like the records. I'm showing my age here, but I had like the story records. But I mean, it's really recently I've started to really appreciate again, the Hammer films and things like that. I love those because they just have so much, to them. But yeah, I can't remember really what attracted me, initially to this, it's just something that I find just endlessly fascinating. And there's, for every author I find, I'm finding constantly more of them. So yeah, I never get bored. I can say that. I really enjoy my work. It's really fun and entertaining.
That's brilliant. I think that's a good place to end on. But before you go, where is your book available from?
Right. Well, probably the best place to start is the Handheld Press website. That you can find all of Kate McDonald's, the directors. Her books are there. She's constantly redesigning and adding new editions, so you can find both editions there. She recently did a British Weird, and we're also sort of looking ahead. We're actually working on some more volumes dedicated to single authors. So we'll have some editions coming out in the next year or two based on, we have a D.K. Broster in the works. We have a Helen Simpson. Eleanor Morden is coming out next year. So, I really would invite people to check out the Handheld Press website. That's a great resource. And I think if you are not in the UK, Kate has worked really hard with distributors. If you go to your independent bookstore, they should be able to order any of the books you'd like.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for your time, Melissa. That's been really interesting. And I say I thoroughly enjoyed the stories in the book. I also like the fact that you have little footnotes explaining some of the terms that crop up from time to time.
That's really, yeah, people have given Kate really good feedback from the notes. And I think that's really great how she's designing these books. Yeah.
Once again, thank you ever so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And good luck with all your projects in the new year.
Well, thank you.
Once again, a big thank you to Melissa Edmundson. And you can discover more about the publishers of Women's Weird 2 on the Handheld Press website at www.handheldpress.co.uk. Still on the subject of the supernatural, here's a winter ghost story, a tale of a true haunting for you. The location is Ickenham Station on the London Underground. It's on the Piccadilly and Metropolitan lines, although be warned, it's way out in Zone 6, almost at the far western end of the tube network. Now, it's said on winter's evenings, a ghostly figure of a woman wearing a red scarf stands at the end of the London-bound platform, close to where she either accidentally fell or jumped onto the live rail and was fatally electrocuted. She sometimes waves before disappearing, and according to the paranormal database, she was first seen in the 1950s. It's a bit sad about the ghost wearing a jolly red scarf, isn't it? And that's it. Before we go, here's one final thought. I was recently asked to describe the part of Norfolk I live in. I'd say it's a liminal place. Flint and clay, big skies and soaring medieval towers, and water, lots of water, brooks and rivers, meres and broads, estuaries and ocean, which is why it's the perfect home for this show. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you for listening in. Please join me again next time. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.